My name is Elena, and I am 29 years old. I calculate disaster for a living. As a corporate risk underwriter in Miami, I specialize in high liability event insurance. I know exactly how quickly a multi-million-dollar gala can collapse from a single missing permit. I spend my days analyzing vulnerabilities and mitigating catastrophic financial loss. But I failed to underwrite the toxicity of my own family. It is 8 in the morning on a sweltering Saturday in South Florida. I am sitting in my parked car sipping a hot cortadito, watching 2 municipal code enforcement officers wrap a thick steel chain around the wrought iron gates of a historic Coral Gables estate. They snap a heavy brass padlock into place. A team of florists stands on the sidewalk crying, holding wilting bouquets of white hydrangeas. A luxury catering truck is physically blocked from entering the driveway by a parked city cruiser. Inside that estate, my sister Madeline is supposed to walk down the aisle in exactly 4 hours. She will not be walking anywhere. The historic venue is legally shut down. Commercial vendors are barred from crossing the threshold, and I am the one who pulled the plug. If your own mother stole your dream wedding venue and gifted it to your sister right in front of your face, would you scream or would you start plotting? Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your age, your location, and your local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Welcome to Sofia Told Stories. Now let me take you back 6 months to a suffocating family dinner where my sister hijacked my wedding and sealed her own devastating ruin. It was late summer. The humid, heavy air of Coral Gables pressed against the open patio doors of my mother Victoria's opulent dining room. The rich scent of blooming night jasmine drifted inside, mixing with the smell of roasted pork and expensive red wine. I sat at the table next to my fiancé, Julian. Julian is a marine biologist working in the Florida Keys. He is grounded, patient, and entirely uninterested in high society games. He anchored me in a family that viewed every interaction as a social transaction. I was happy. I had brought my initial wedding mood boards to dinner, spreading the thick cardstock presentation across the edge of the imported mahogany table. The boards detailed the specific historic coastal estate I had booked for next spring, complete with lighting schematics and preferred vendor lists. I had paid the $10,000 deposit a week prior. My sister Madeline sat across from me. She is a local lifestyle influencer whose self-worth is entirely tethered to public validation. She nervously tapped her manicured nails against her wine glass. Next to her sat her fiancé, Carter. Carter is a commercial real estate broker who operates on Brickell Avenue. He wore a tailored linen suit and drove a leased Maserati, but the polished exterior felt thin. Throughout dinner, he barely touched his food. He kept checking a secondary burner phone hidden in his lap, a sheen of sweat gathering at his temples, despite the air conditioning. Halfway through the meal, Madeline clinked her fork against her crystal water glass. She stood up, a bright, nervous smile plastered across her face. "Carter and I have some amazing news," she announced, her voice pitching high. "We finally picked our wedding date and secured our venue." She named a date in late April. She named the exact historic coastal estate featured on my mood boards. A cold, numb shock washed over me. I blinked, looking from Madeline to the thick cardstock presentation resting inches from her plate. "Madeline," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "that is my venue. I booked that exact date last week. I paid the deposit." Madeline looked down, refusing to meet my gaze. She reached for Carter's arm. Carter offered a slick, unapologetic grin. Actually, Elena, Carter interjected, leaning back in his chair. "Victoria took care of that for us. We needed a premier location to host a few VIP foreign investors I am courting for a new development project. Your spot was perfect." I turned my head slowly, staring at my mother. Victoria sat at the head of the table, adjusting her linen napkin with maddening precision. She did not look guilty. She looked annoyed that I was questioning her authority. I called the estate manager yesterday. Elena Victoria stated her tone flat and commanding. I transferred the $10,000 deposit under my name over to Madeline's account. Carter needs this event to secure his business deals. You and Julian are so low maintenance anyway. You do not need a grand historic estate for your little party. You can just pick another date and find a nice restaurant on the water. Do not make a fuss about this. Madeline needs the security. The air vanished from the room. My own mother had covertly contacted my venue, used her status as the financial guarantor of the initial deposit, and legally transferred my dream wedding to my sister. She did it to appease a flashy broker who viewed a sacred family milestone as a networking opportunity. She looked at my quiet, stable relationship with Julian and decided it was worth sacrificing to feed Madeline's endless hunger for public validation. I looked at the mood boards resting on the table. The detailed vendor lists, the permit requirements, the carefully curated aesthetic. Madeline was not just taking the building. She was stealing the entire blueprint of my wedding. Because she lacked the substance to build her own, the logical risk underwriter inside my brain tried to calculate a rational response. I tried to formulate a cool, detached argument about municipal contracts and vendor exclusivity. But the betrayal cut too deep, bypassing my logic and striking a raw, exposed nerve. I was holding my delicate crystal champagne flute. The sheer injustice of the theft, the casual dismissal of my happiness, boiled over into a sudden, blinding physical reaction. I gripped the stem of the glass. I squeezed my fist with all the strength I possessed. The crystal shattered with a sharp, terrifying crack. Jagged shards of glass bit deep into the palm of my bare hand. Warm, dark blood immediately welled up from the cuts, dripping down my wrist and landing with heavy, wet drops onto Victoria's pristine, imported table runner. Madeline shrieked, jumping back from the table. Carter cursed, pushing his chair away to avoid the splashing wine. Julian grabbed my arm, his face pale, wrapping his cloth napkin tightly around my bleeding hand. I did not scream. I did not deliver a witty cinematic comeback. The pain in my hand was sharp and grounding, anchoring me to the reality of what my family truly was. I pulled my hand away from Julian. I stood up, the broken stem of the flute falling from my palm and hitting the hardwood floor. I did not gather my mood boards. I left them sitting on the table, a silent, glittering bait. I knew Madeline was lazy. I knew she would use my exact vendor lists and my specific event schematics to build her stolen wedding. And that laziness would tie her directly to a legal kill switch I already controlled. I turned and walked out the patio doors into the humid night, ignoring my mother's frantic demands to come back and clean up the blood. Julian followed close behind me. I let them keep the reservation. They thought they had outsmarted me, pulling off a ruthless high society hijack. They had no idea the venue they just stole required a highly specific municipal variance to operate. And I was the only person in Miami who held the paperwork. Julian drove us back to my condo in silence. He navigated the heavy Miami traffic, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He did not ask me if I was okay. He knew the answer. He pulled into my parking garage and escorted me upstairs. In the master bathroom, he carefully unwrapped the bloody linen napkin from my hand. He cleaned the cuts with antiseptic, picking out 3 tiny shards of crystal with tweezers. The physical pain was a dull throb compared to the crushing weight settling over my chest. He bandaged my hand, kissed my forehead, and told me he was going to sleep on the sofa to give me space. He understood I needed to process the betrayal alone. I walked into my kitchen and flipped the overhead lights on. The sprawling, white quartz island was usually my sanctuary, a place where I drafted risk assessment models and organized my life. Now, sitting squarely in the center of the island, was my secondary wedding binder. It contained fabric swatches, floral contracts, and the detailed timeline of the day my mother had just handed to my sister. I stared at the binder. The shock of the dinner wore off, leaving behind a raw, suffocating grief. Madeline was my younger sister. We had shared secrets and clothes, but Victoria had spent 2 decades pitting us against each other, cultivating a toxic dynamic where Madeline's anxiety demanded constant appeasement. My mother viewed my stability as a resource to be mined to comfort Madeline. Tonight, she mined my happiness to secure a fake real estate broker. I reached into the pantry and pulled out a half-empty bottle of cheap, dark rum left over from a holiday party. I did not bother with a glass. I unscrewed the cap and drank straight from the bottle. The harsh liquor burned my throat, hitting my empty stomach with a sudden, anxious warmth. I slid down the front of the kitchen cabinets until I was sitting on the cold tile floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, the injured hand throbbing, and let out a loud, ugly sob. I cried with the unrestrained, messy grief of a daughter realizing she was completely expendable. I cried for the beautiful wedding I had meticulously planned and the fiancé who deserved a family that celebrated him. I wallowed in the pathetic humiliation of bleeding on my mother's table while she defended the man who stole my venue. I sat on the floor for an hour, the rum dulling the sharp edges of my panic. But as the tears dried, leaving my face tight and salty, the analytical risk underwriter inside my brain began to reboot. I wiped my eyes with the back of my uninjured hand. I thought about the historic coastal estate they had just stolen. The venue was a crown jewel of Miami architecture, situated directly on the water, bordering a highly protected residential neighborhood. It was notorious in the event planning industry. The estate managers were strict. The Miami-Dade County municipal codes governing the property were even stricter. To host a gathering of more than 50 people involving amplified music and the serving of hard liquor on that specific coastal property, the host was required by law to secure a special event noise and alcohol variance. The bureaucratic labyrinth of the Miami-Dade municipal offices is a nightmare. Obscure permits dictate the survival of every coastal event, and the variance for this specific estate took months of public hearings and neighborhood board approvals to secure. The venue did not provide the permit. The liability rested entirely on the individual hosting the event. I pushed myself off the floor, the alcohol-fueled grief morphing into a cold, razor-sharp calculation. I walked over to my home office and booted up my laptop. I logged into the secure portal of my personal LLC. Months ago, knowing the sluggish pace of the municipal government, I had proactively applied for the special event noise and alcohol variance for my late April wedding date. Because of my professional credentials and clean underwriting history, the county had expedited the approval. I opened the digital file. The official municipal permit, bearing the county seal and the signature of the zoning director, stared back at me. It was approved for the exact date and location my sister had just hijacked. And etched in bold legal print at the bottom of the document was a crucial defining clause. This variance is non-transferable. It is issued exclusively to the LLC holding the primary liability insurance bond. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. Carter and Victoria transferred the initial $10,000 venue deposit, assuming the financial receipt secured the building. They were arrogant enough to believe money solved every logistical hurdle. They did not understand the granular mechanics of municipal liability. They had the reservation, but I held the legal authority to turn the lights on. Without my specific, non-transferable variance, it was illegal for commercial vendors to cross the property line. It was illegal to play music. It was illegal to pour a single glass of champagne. They had stolen a beautiful, empty shell. I possessed the legal kill switch. How long could you sit on a legal kill switch while your sister brags about stealing your perfect day online? How do you swallow your pride and play the victim when you know you have already rigged the building with explosives? I closed the laptop, the trap snapping shut in my mind. I needed to ensure they remained entirely complacent. If I fought them over the venue, Carter might hire an event planner competent enough to check the municipal registries. If he discovered I held the variance, he would have 6 months to scramble and apply for a new one. I had to lull them into a false sense of absolute security. I had to let Carter commit massive financial resources to an event that was legally doomed to fail. I picked up my phone, navigating to my text messages. I opened the thread with my mother. I typed a polite, defeated message, forcing my thumbs to hit the keys despite the lingering sting in my palm. Mom, I am sorry about the scene tonight and the broken glass. I was just shocked. Julian and I talked it over. You are right. Madeline needs the security more than we do. We will find a smaller venue. Let Carter use the estate for his investors. I hit send. It was the ultimate bait. A total, unconditional surrender that played directly into Victoria's ego. She would read the text as proof that her maternal authority remained absolute. Carter would view it as a submission to his alpha male posturing. They would drop their guard completely. I walked out to the living room where Julian was sleeping on the sofa. I knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. He stirred, opening his eyes groggily. "Are you okay?" he murmured, reaching for my hand. "I am fine," I whispered, leaning down to kiss him. "Let them have the venue, Julian. We are going to let them build the biggest, most expensive wedding Miami has ever seen." Julian frowned, confused by the sudden shift in my demeanor. "But it is your dream location, Elena. You planned every detail." I smiled, the cold calculation settling deep into my bones. A building is just a liability risk, Julian, and Carter just assumed a massive, unmitigated risk without reading the fine print. The strategy was flawless in its silent execution. Over the next few months, I retreated into the shadows. I watched Madeline post endless updates on social media, bragging about the historic coastal estate and the lavish upgrades Carter was booking to impress his VIP investors. I watched him commit over $150,000 to 12-piece bands, custom floral ceilings, and imported caviar walls. Every vendor he hired, every deposit he paid, depended entirely on a permit he did not own. I thought my silent withdrawal would insulate me from the emotional crossfire while I waited for the wedding day to arrive. But a sudden, unexpected gesture from Madeline would drag me back into the messy, complicated reality of our sisterhood, triggering a chaotic public confrontation that would hand Carter the exact legal ammunition he needed to launch a devastating counterattack. The text message conceding the venue secured 3 months of relative peace. I watched Madeline's wedding planning escalate through the lens of her perfectly curated social media feeds. She booked the caviar walls. She secured the 12-piece band. Carter's name was plastered across local business journals, touting the upcoming nuptials as the premier networking event of the Miami spring season. I remained silent, a ghost, observing the construction of a magnificent, expensive sandcastle built directly below the high tide line. Then Madeline broke the silence. She sent a text asking to meet, claiming she had a bridesmaid gift she needed to deliver in person. I did not want to see her. The bitter resentment of the theft still burned hot in my chest. But the strategic underwriter in me knew that ignoring her entirely might raise Carter's suspicions. I agreed to meet, but I dictated the venue. I refused to sit in a quiet, air-conditioned Buckhead bistro where she could leverage tears and manipulate the narrative. I chose a busy walk-up Ventanita in the heart of Little Havana. It was a chaotic, vibrant environment. The air hung thick with the heavy scent of roasting espresso, sweet guava pastries, and the exhaust of slow-moving traffic. Old men played dominoes at a nearby table, shouting in rapid-fire Spanish. It was a public, unapologetic space. If Madeline intended to throw a tantrum to assuage her guilt, she would have to do it over the roar of the city. I arrived early, ordering a cortadito, the dark, sweet espresso pulling me into focus. I stood near the tiled counter watching Madeline approach. She looked exhausted. The polished influencer facade was slipping, revealing the severe, crippling anxiety that dictated her life. Her designer sunglasses hid the dark circles under her eyes, but the frantic, anxious twisting of her hands gave her away. She was terrified of fading into obscurity, terrified of losing Carter's conditional approval, and terrified of the sister she had just betrayed. She stopped a few feet from the counter, pulling a small, rectangular package wrapped in brown paper from her handbag. She held it out to me, her hands trembling slightly. "Elena," she started, her voice barely carrying over the noise of the street, "I know you hate me right now. I know what Carter and Mom did was awful. I tried to tell Carter to find another venue, but he said the investors demanded a historic estate, and if he lost the deal, he would leave. I was so scared, Elena. I am sorry." I did not take the package. I stared at her, the resentment hardening into a cold, tight knot. "You are sorry," I repeated the words, tasting like ash. "You stole my wedding date, Madeline. You let Mom humiliate me at the dinner table, and you did not say a word. You are not sorry you did it. You are just sorry you have to look me in the eye." Madeline flinched, fresh tears spilling from beneath her sunglasses. She pushed the brown paper package closer, practically shoving it against my chest. "Please, just open it," she begged. "I wanted you to be my maid of honor. I wanted to give you this to prove I still love you." I took the package, the brown paper rough against my healing palm. I tore the wrapping away, revealing a worn, faded leather notebook. I recognized it instantly. It was a shared childhood journal. When Madeline was 8 and I was 10, we used to pass the notebook back and forth, writing secret messages to each other to hide from Victoria's suffocating control. I opened the cover. The pages were filled with our childish handwriting, detailing our fears, our dreams, and our promises to always protect each other. Would you accept a sentimental, loving gift from the exact sibling who just robbed you blind? Does a token of childhood affection erase the adult betrayal staring you in the face? The profound tragedy of my sister hit me. She was not a pure malicious villain. She was a deeply insecure woman suffering from severe middle child syndrome, anchored to a mother who only valued her when she performed. Madeline genuinely loved me. The journal was proof that beneath the anxiety and the influencer vanity, she remembered the bond we shared. But her terror of losing her high society status, her absolute desperation to secure a man like Carter, overrode her morality. She was a hostage to her own vanity, trying to bribe her jailer with sentimental memories. I closed the journal, my throat tight with conflicting emotions. I wanted to hug her. I wanted to tell her Carter was a fraud and she needed to run. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer a fraction of grace, but I never got the chance. "Well, isn't this a touching family reunion?" a slick, arrogant voice drawled, cutting through the heavy emotional moment. Carter materialized from the crowd, stepping up to the ventanita. He wore a tailored linen suit and suede loafers, looking entirely out of place among the working-class patrons of Little Havana. He wrapped a possessive arm around Madeline's waist, pulling her tightly against his side. She stiffened instantly, the authentic vulnerability vanishing, replaced by the rigid, obedient posture of a trophy wife. Carter had tracked her phone. He did not trust Madeline to speak to me alone. He knew the guilt was eating her alive, and he needed to ensure the narrative remained under his control. "What are you doing here, Carter?" I asked, my voice dropping the journal into my purse. "Just making sure my beautiful bride isn't stressing herself out." He smiled, a predatory flash of white teeth. "I know you're probably still bitter about the venue, Elena, but let us be honest. That estate was wasted on you and Julian. A marine biologist pulling a government salary does not need a caviar wall. You guys belong at a public beach pitching a tent. We're hosting international developers. We operate on different levels." The carefully constructed restraint I had maintained for 3 months evaporated. The journal, the fake apology, the condescending arrogance, it all boiled over into a sudden, blinding, physical rage. He was not just insulting me. He was insulting the quiet, grounded man who had bandaged my bleeding hand while my family abandoned me. I did not think. I did not calculate the risk. I reacted. I gripped the small paper cup containing my freshly poured, scalding hot cortadito. I swung my arm in a fast, violent arc, hurling the dark, boiling espresso directly downward onto Carter's immaculate suede loafers and the cuffs of his tailored linen pants. The hot liquid splashed across his legs, staining the expensive fabric with dark, spreading patches. Carter let out a sharp, startled yelp, jumping backward and colliding with a man holding a tray of pastries. The tray flipped, sending guava pastries scattering across the pavement. "You arrogant, pathetic parasite," I screamed, my voice raw and echoing off the concrete walls, silencing the domino players. "Do not ever speak about Julian again. You are leasing a life you cannot afford, and you are using my sister as a prop." Carter stared down at his ruined shoes, his face flushing a deep mottled red. The slick charm vanished completely, replaced by a cold, menacing fury. He pointed a trembling finger at me, ignoring the crowd of locals watching the spectacle. "You are a psychotic bitch," he hissed, his voice vibrating with venom. "I tried to be nice. I tried to let you bow out gracefully, but you just crossed a line. You are going to regret this, Elena. I will make sure you cannot even afford a tent on the beach when I am done with you." He grabbed Madeline's arm, dragging the sobbing woman away from the ventanita toward his parked Maserati. I stood amidst the ruined pastries, my chest heaving, the adrenaline crashing hard and fast. The outburst was immensely satisfying. The look of pure shock on his face provided a fleeting hit of triumphant vengeance. But as I watched his car speed away, the analytical underwriter in my brain began flashing warning sirens. I had lost control. I had physically assaulted him in a crowded public space, confirming every unhinged stereotype he had likely fed my mother. I handed him a public display of aggression. I walked back to my car, my hands shaking. I knew Carter would retaliate. He operated in a world of aggressive corporate litigation, but I assumed he would file a civil suit for harassment or attempt to sue me for the cost of the ruined suit. I underestimated the sheer, ruthless desperation of a man trying to protect a massive financial scam. Carter was not going to sue me for dry cleaning. He was going to weaponize the justice system, using a forged document to legally silence me, stripping away my rights and forcing me into a suffocating legal nightmare that threatened to derail my entire revenge strategy before the wedding invitations were even mailed. The satisfaction of ruining Carter's suede loafers evaporated the moment I returned to my condo. The analytical risk underwriter reclaimed control of my brain, categorizing the public outburst as a critical, tactical error. I needed to divert his attention immediately. If Carter scrutinized my LLC, he might discover the special event noise and alcohol variants I held in reserve. I had to force him to look in the wrong direction. I authorized my legal team to file a noisy, expensive civil suit directly against the historic venue, citing a blatant breach of contract. It was a classic red herring. I knew the venue managers would panic and immediately loop Carter into the litigation, since he currently held the reservation. The lawsuit demanded substantial financial damages, forcing Carter to hire expensive defense attorneys to protect his stolen asset. I wanted him to burn his limited cash fighting a phantom battle over a building while completely ignoring the municipal permit required to actually use it. The strategy worked perfectly for 2 weeks. Carter's legal team filed aggressive motions to dismiss, wasting billable hours defending the venue's right to transfer the deposit. I monitored the docket from my office, feeling a cool, clinical satisfaction. He was distracted. Then, the trap I set snapped back with a devastating illegal maneuver I never anticipated. I received a frantic phone call from my lead attorney demanding my immediate presence at his downtown Miami office. The firm occupied the top floor of a glass tower on Brickell Avenue. The environment was designed to project absolute corporate dominance. The air conditioning was cranked to a freezing 65 degrees, an aggressive climate control tactic meant to keep opponents physically uncomfortable and off balance during negotiations. I sat in a stiff leather chair, shivering in my silk blouse, while my attorney slid a thick legal folder across the polished glass table. The heading on the first page read, "Emergency Petition for Temporary Restraining Order and Injunctive Relief." Carter did not just countersue. He escalated the conflict into criminal territory. My attorney explained the terrifying reality unfolding in the civil courts. Carter's lawyers claimed I was a hostile, unstable family member actively sabotaging a multi-million-dollar business event. They used the public coffee-throwing incident at the Ventanita as evidence of my erratic, violent behavior. But the physical assault was only the foundation of their petition. The kill shot was the document attached to Appendix B. I flipped to the back of the folder. Staring up at me was a digital release of liability. The document stated that my LLC formally surrendered all municipal rights and permits associated with the historic coastal estate, transferring them directly to Carter's holding company. And resting neatly on the bottom signature line was my name. My blood ran cold. The freezing air of the conference room seemed to crystallize in my lungs. "That is not my signature," I whispered, tracing the blue ink on the printed page. "I never signed a release. I never surrendered the variance." "It is a digital forgery," my attorney stated, his voice grim, confirming my worst fear. But Carter submitted it with a notarized affidavit from a private broker. The judge reviewed the evidence of the physical altercation, the breach of contract suit, and this signed release. The judge granted the emergency temporary restraining order this morning. The weight of the legal blockade crashed down on me. A temporary restraining order is a blunt instrument. It legally barred me from contacting the venue, the municipal zoning office, or any vendors associated with the event. If I attempted to enforce my variance or alert the county to the forgery, I would be in direct violation of a court order, facing immediate arrest for contempt. Carter was not just a slick, arrogant broker. He was a desperate, cornered criminal. He realized my LLC held the permit rights, and rather than attempt to secure a new one, he simply forged my surrender. He weaponized the justice system, using a fraudulent document to legally silence me, stripping away my authority and clearing the path for his stolen wedding. What is your next move when the parasite stealing your venue weaponizes the justice system with a forged document? How do you fight a monster when the law legally mandates your surrender? I left the law firm, my mind spinning in a dark, frantic spiral. I needed to file an immediate motion to challenge the forgery, but my attorney warned me the process required handwriting experts, digital forensic audits, and weeks of evidentiary hearings. Carter had secured the TRO, ensuring the legal freeze would remain active right through the wedding date. He had legally trapped me. I walked into the parking garage of the courthouse, stepping into the heavy metal elevator car. The doors slid shut, sealing me inside the steel box. The slow descent to the ground floor felt like a physical representation of my failing strategy. I was an expert in risk management. I calculated disaster for a living. And I had just been completely outmaneuvered by a man operating entirely outside the boundaries of the law. The suffocating panic finally broke through my professional restraint. My chest tightened, refusing to expand. I dropped my leather briefcase, leaning against the cold metal wall of the elevator, gasping for air. The invincible tactician shattered. I was losing my venue, my sister, and now my legal standing. I squeezed my eyes shut, letting out a raw, terrified sob. I pounded my fists against the steel doors, the heavy thuds echoing in the small enclosed space. I hit the metal again and again, the physical pain grounding the spiraling anxiety in my brain. I was helpless. The justice system was protecting the thief and punishing the victim. The elevator chimed the doors opening to the humid parking garage. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, picking up my briefcase and stumbling toward my car. I needed to regroup. I needed to find a way to break the TRO without violating the court order. I had to pivot my strategy away from the slow civil courts and find a faster, more lethal weapon. I drove back to my condo, determined to authorize my attorneys to launch a massive, aggressive forensic audit of Carter's notarized affidavit. I believed I could outspend him in legal fees, forcing his fraudulent notary to crack under the pressure. But my strategy relied on access to the war chest I had carefully saved for my wedding. I did not know that Carter, anticipating my financial retaliation, had already activated his ultimate weapon. He knew he could not drain my bank accounts, but he knew someone who could. When I arrived at my apartment, I would not find a legal solution waiting for me. I would find my mother standing in my living room, preparing to deliver a devastating emotional blow, forcing me to confront a horrific childhood trauma that would ultimately lead to the total freezing of my legal defense funds. The humid air inside my condo felt heavy thick with the impending threat of a South Florida afternoon thunderstorm. I tossed my keys onto the glass entryway table, my hands still shaking from the panic attack in the courthouse elevator. I needed to strategize. I pulled the thick stack of legal defense bills from my briefcase, deliberately leaving the invoices spread across the kitchen counter. I wanted the staggering hourly rates to serve as a physical reminder of the financial damage Carter's forged restraining order was inflicting on my life. I needed to authorize my attorney to hire a digital forensic expert immediately to challenge the fake signature. Before I could pick up my phone, a sharp, aggressive knock echoed through the quiet apartment. I looked through the peephole. Victoria stood in the hallway, twisting the strap of her designer handbag, her face pale and drawn. I unlocked the door, bracing myself for another demand to surrender the venue. But my mother did not look angry. She looked terrified. She pushed past me, walking straight into the kitchen. She saw the legal invoices resting on the counter, the bold numbers detailing thousands of dollars in litigation fees. Her shoulders slumped. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, ragged sob that startled me. "Elena, please," she wept, her voice cracking under the weight of genuine panic. "You have to stop this. Carter's lawyers called me. They said you are preparing to challenge the injunction. They said it could drag the wedding into a criminal investigation. You are going to ruin your sister. You are going to destroy her life over a building." The audacity of her plea struck me like a physical blow. "A building," I repeated, my voice tight with suppressed rage. "He forged my signature, Victoria. He committed a felony to steal my legal rights. He is a criminal, and you want me to drop the investigation to protect a party?" Victoria dropped her hand, stepping closer, her eyes pleading. "You do not understand how fragile Madeline is. If this wedding falls apart, if she loses Carter, she will not survive it. She needs this security, Elena. I am begging you, as your mother, drop the lawsuit. Let her have the day." The profound anguish in her voice triggered a visceral, violent flashback. The luxury condo dissolved, replaced by the sterile, blinding white lights of a pediatric hospital corridor. I was 8 years old. Madeline was 6. She had contracted a rare, aggressive viral infection. Her temperature spiked to a lethal 105 degrees. She was seizing, her tiny body thrashing violently on the hospital bed, surrounded by frantic doctors. I stood in the hallway, terrified, clutching a stuffed bear. Victoria had grabbed my shoulders, her fingernails digging deep into my skin, bruising my collarbone. She pulled me close, her breath hot and panicked against my ear. "You have to pray for her, Elena," she had hissed, her eyes wide with a terrifying, desperate grief. "If she survives this, you owe her. You have to let her have everything she wants. She is the fragile one. You owe her your strength forever." Madeline survived, but the dynamic of our family was permanently altered. Victoria's maternal guilt over nearly losing her youngest child warped into a toxic, relentless favoritism. She overcompensated for the trauma by demanding I constantly shrink my own life to ensure Madeline never experienced a moment of discomfort or anxiety. Can a mother's cruelty ever be forgiven if it stems from the desperate fear of losing a sick child? Does a past medical trauma justify a lifetime of present emotional abuse? I stared at my mother, the memory of her bruising grip anchoring me to the present. I am not 8 years old anymore, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, exhausted whisper. I do not owe her my wedding. I do not owe her my silence. Carter is a predator, and I am going to expose his forgery. I am calling my attorney right now. The tears vanished from Victoria's face instantly. The weeping, desperate mother disappeared, replaced by the ruthless, calculating Coral Gables matriarch. She straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her expensive silk blouse. You can call them, Elena, Victoria stated, her tone dropping to absolute freezing zero, but they are not going to answer. I froze, my hand hovering over my phone. What are you talking about? I already made a few phone calls this morning, she continued, a cold, victorious smirk touching the corner of her mouth. The senior partner at your boutique law firm represents the primary real estate holdings for your father's corporate trust. I simply reminded him that our family accounts generate millions in billable hours every year. I suggested that representing a disgruntled daughter in a petty family squabble against her future brother-in-law might constitute a severe conflict of interest. The air rushed out of my lungs. He agreed with my assessment. Victoria said, picking up her designer handbag, "Your firm is dropping your case, Elena. They will send you the formal notice of withdrawal this afternoon. You have no lawyers. You cannot fight the injunction. Let it go." The sheer, terrifying magnitude of her betrayal crashed down on me. Victoria did not just steal my wedding venue. She used her elite social status and her financial leverage to actively strip me of my legal representation. She blackmailed my own attorneys, forcing them to abandon my defense. She ensured the forged temporary restraining order would remain intact, isolating me completely, trapping me in a legal cage with no way to fight back. The logic center of my brain, the meticulous risk underwriter, short-circuited. The years of swallowing my pride, the decades of forced servitude to Madeline's fragility, the brutal realization that my mother would actively sabotage my safety to protect a criminal, boiled over into a sudden, blinding verbal assault. I did not calculate the risk. I reacted with pure, unadulterated venom. I wish the fever had taken her. I screamed, my voice raw and echoing off the glass windows, startling Victoria so badly she dropped her purse. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and suffocating. The horrific words hung in the air, a toxic, irreversible poison. I stared at my mother, watching the color drain completely from her face. I wish it had killed her when she was 6, I continued, the cruel momentum carrying me forward, unable to stop the destruction. Because then, maybe you would have actually loved the daughter who lived, instead of turning me into a human shield for a pathetic, weak parasite. Victoria stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and a deep, profound revulsion. She did not argue. She did not yell. She simply turned around and walked out of the apartment, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. The moment she was gone, the adrenaline evaporated, leaving me hollow and physically sick. I sank onto the kitchen floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The regret was immediate and crushing. I had just wished death upon my own sister. I had spoken a cruelty so horrific I barely recognized my own voice. I was acting like a monster, poisoned by the very toxicity I was trying to escape. Outside, the violent afternoon thunderstorm finally broke. Heavy rain lashed against the hurricane impact windows, the sky turning a bruised, dark gray, matching the isolated, terrifying reality of my situation. I was completely alone. I had no venue. I had no lawyers. The civil courts were closed to me, locked behind a forged document and maternal blackmail. If I wanted to stop Carter from stealing my life, I could not rely on the justice system. I had to pivot my strategy, relying entirely on my own professional expertise. I had to become the predator, launching a surgical corporate espionage operation to uncover the federal crimes funding his fake empire. But the secrets I was about to excavate would reveal a financial rot so deep it would force me to weaponize my own career, destroying his entire world with a single devastating keystroke. The formal notice of withdrawal from my law firm arrived via email exactly 2 hours after my mother left. The phrasing was clinical and brief, citing an unavoidable conflict of interest within their corporate portfolio. Victoria had executed the threat perfectly. She severed my legal defense, leaving me isolated behind the impenetrable wall of Carter's forged temporary restraining order. If I hired a new attorney, the onboarding process and the initial evidentiary hearings required to challenge a forged signature would take months. The wedding was scheduled in less than 8 weeks. The civil courts were a dead end. I wiped the residual tears from my face, staring at the rain lashing against the hurricane impact windows of my condo. The horrific words I screamed at my mother still echoed in my ears, a heavy, shameful weight anchoring me to the floor. But guilt is a luxury reserved for peacetime. I was locked in a war with a predator, and I needed a new weapon. If the legal system refused to dismantle his fraudulent injunction, I had to shift the battlefield to my own domain. I am a corporate risk underwriter. I spend my life investigating the hidden financial vulnerabilities of massive commercial entities. I evaluate debt structures, shell companies, and hidden liabilities before authoring multi-million-dollar insurance policies. Carter operated a commercial real estate brokerage on Brickell Avenue, an environment notorious for aggressive posturing, where brokers frequently leased luxury cars and expensive condos to project an illusion of invincibility while secretly drowning in highly leveraged, toxic debt. I opened my laptop, booting up my professional underwriting software. I initiated a deep dive investigation into Carter's corporate footprint. I needed access to the internal financial flow of his brokerage. Direct hacking is a federal crime, but social engineering is simply a matter of asking the right question to the wrong person. I drafted an email, heavily laden with dense industry jargon, pretending to represent a commercial liability insurance provider, conducting a standard risk assessment audit on one of his recently acquired properties. I bypassed Carter entirely, aiming the request at a low-level junior accountant listed on his firm's website directory. The bait was highly technical and utterly boring. I requested routine compliance data, casually burying a demand for the firm's primary operational routing numbers within a spreadsheet of mundane insurance requirements. The junior accountant, likely overwhelmed and eager to clear a tedious task from his desk, fell for the deception immediately. He replied within the hour, attaching the unprotected financial routing documents. I downloaded the data, importing the numbers into my tracking software. The digital architecture of his business materialized on my dual monitors. The initial scan confirmed my suspicions regarding the hijacked wedding venue. Carter had not randomly selected the historic coastal estate to appease Madeline's aesthetic. The routing numbers revealed a series of pending international wire transfers linked to a syndicate of wealthy foreign investors. He was actively courting these developers for a massive waterfront acquisition project. His emails logged in the municipal zoning databases indicated he promised these specific investors a lavish private gala at the exact historic property I had booked. Carter weaponized Madeline's sibling rivalry. He manipulated her insecurity, convincing her to steal my date and venue, not out of love, but out of sheer desperation to secure a corporate networking event that would save his failing brokerage. But the geographical deception was merely the symptom. The disease hiding in the ledger was far more lethal. As I mapped the outgoing payments for the extravagant wedding upgrades, the caviar walls, the imported floral ceilings, the 12-piece band, I noticed a horrifying discrepancy. The $150,000 covering these deposits did not originate from Carter's personal accounts or his standard operational funds. The money was siphoned directly from his firm's protected client escrow accounts. My breath caught in my throat. In the state of Florida, commingling or misdirecting client escrow funds is an absolute violation of fiduciary duty. It is not just a civil breach of contract. It is a severe federal crime carrying mandatory prison sentences and immediate disbarment. Carter was running a classic Ponzi scheme, stealing from his current real estate clients to fund a lavish public relations stunt, hoping the resulting investment capital would allow him to replace the stolen money before the federal auditors noticed the missing funds. When you find the federal crime that will destroy your enemy, do you report it immediately, or do you wait for maximum collateral damage? Do you show your hand early to secure a quick victory, or do you let them walk blindly into a trap from which they can never return? I printed the escrow logs, the heavy, undeniable proof of his federal fraud, resting on my desk. I held the keys to federal prison. I could send this dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission tonight and watch agents raid his Brickell office by morning. But if I triggered the investigation now, the wedding would simply be canceled. Carter would go to jail, but the public humiliation would be contained. I wanted him to burn on the biggest stage possible. I wanted the illusion he stole from me to collapse while he was standing in the center of it. I sat at my desk for hours analyzing the data, the exhaustion and adrenaline grinding my nerves down to a frayed, raw wire. The apartment was dark, the storm outside having settled into a persistent, sullen drizzle. The sound of the front door unlocking startled me. Julian walked into the condo, carrying a wet umbrella and a bag of takeout food. He looked tired, his clothes damp from the rain, but he offered a soft, encouraging smile as he set the food on the kitchen island. "I got your favorite," he said, walking over to the office doorway. "How are you holding up? Have the lawyers figured out a strategy to fight the injunction?" I stared at him, the paranoia and stress of the corporate espionage clouding my judgment. "The lawyers dropped me, Julian," I snapped, my voice harsh and defensive. "My mother blackmailed them. I am fighting this alone." Julian frowned, stepping into the office, his expression shifting to deep concern. "Elena, I am sorry. I did not know. We will find another firm. We can figure this out together." "Figure it out together," I mocked, the exhaustion fueling a sudden, vicious resentment. "You have been in the Keys for 3 days, Julian. I've been sitting here getting sued by a criminal and abandoned by my mother. You do not understand this family. You just want everything to be peaceful and easy. You are not helping me fight." Julian stopped, his eyes widening in shock at the unprovoked attack. "I am trying to support you, Elena," he said, his voice quiet and steady, refusing to match my hostility. "I cannot fix your mother's cruelty, but I am here. You do not have to push me away just because you are angry at them." The gentle, rational response enraged me further. I was acting like a wounded animal lashing out at the only person offering sanctuary because the pain of my mother's betrayal was too massive to process. "I am not pushing you away," I yelled, slamming my hand onto the desk. "I am trying to save myself because no one else is going to do it. Just leave me alone." Julian looked at me, a profound sadness settling into his features. He nodded, slowly, turning around and walking out of the office, leaving the takeout food untouched on the counter. The quiet click of the guest bedroom door shutting echoed loudly in the silent apartment. I dropped my face into my hands, the crushing weight of my isolation bearing down on me. I had just picked a vicious, unnecessary fight with the man who loved me, driving away my only anchor because the toxic warfare of my family was poisoning my own character. I was entirely alone. But the isolation clarified the mission. The civil courts were closed to me. My family had abandoned me. The only path forward was to execute a dual-track retaliation, utilizing my literal day job to sever the lifeblood of the stolen wedding, triggering an irreversible catastrophe that would detonate precisely at the moment Carter thought he had won. The fight with Julian left a cold, hollow space in my chest. I spent the night sleeping fitfully on the sofa, waking up to the dull gray light of a humid Miami morning. The air in the condo felt stagnant, mirroring the suffocating reality of my situation. I was legally barred from contacting the venue. My own mother had blackmailed my attorneys. I had the escrow evidence, but reporting it to the authorities now would simply cancel the event, giving Carter an opportunity to spin the narrative and paint himself as a victim of a bureaucratic misunderstanding. I needed a weapon that struck deeper, a mechanism that was entirely outside the jurisdiction of a civil judge. I walked into the kitchen, the untouched takeout bag still sitting on the island, a sharp reminder of my petty, unnecessary cruelty to the man who loved me. The emotional exhaustion finally broke through my rigid professional armor. I opened the pantry, pulling out a massive, family-sized box of stale cheese crackers and a jar of generic chocolate hazelnut spread. I slid down the front of the cabinet sitting on the cold tile floor. I spent the next 45 minutes stress-eating in silence, dipping the crackers directly into the jar, wallowing in a pathetic, paralyzing self-pity. I mourned the wedding I would never have. I mourned the mother who chose a criminal over her own daughter. I mourned the ugly, bitter person this war was forcing me to become. But as I scraped the bottom of the plastic jar, the sugar and the tears ran their course. The pathetic display of self-pity burned out, leaving behind a gritty, cold determination. I am a risk underwriter. My entire career is built on identifying liabilities that other people ignore. Carter thought he had me trapped with a forged signature and a corrupt judge, but he failed to understand the foundational architecture of the event industry. I pushed myself off the floor, brushing crumbs off my sweatpants, and marched into my home office. I booted up my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark room. A historic coastal estate worth tens of millions of dollars does not operate on goodwill and municipal permits alone. It operates on risk mitigation. To host a massive event with hundreds of guests, amplified music, and open bars, the venue requires the host to secure a massive umbrella liability insurance policy. This policy protects the physical property against damages and insulates the estate owners from lawsuits resulting from vendor negligence or guest injuries. Without active umbrella liability coverage, it is legally impossible for the venue to open its doors. The estate management will not allow a single vendor to cross the property line without a verified certificate of insurance. Carter had undoubtedly secured this policy when he hijacked the reservation using his firm's credentials to project financial stability. He assumed the policy was a simple administrative checkbox. He did not realize that the insurance industry operates on a strict code of ethics and zero tolerance for fraud. I opened an encrypted browser window navigating to the corporate portal of the specific international insurance conglomerate that underwrote the venue's liability policies. It was a company I frequently interacted with during my own professional assessments. I knew their reporting protocols. I knew the exact triggers required to initiate an immediate internal audit. I did not just cancel my municipal permit. A permit issue could potentially be resolved with a bribe or a frantic call to a city commissioner. I needed a kill switch that was absolute and irreversible. I drafted an anonymous, highly detailed tip utilizing specific industry terminology to guarantee the claim bypassed the automated filters and landed directly on the desk of a senior fraud investigator. I attached the audited logs proving Carter was actively siphoning funds from protected client escrow accounts to pay the vendors associated with the insured event. The implication for the insurance provider was terrifyingly clear.
If the host is funding a massive event using stolen money, the event itself is an active crime scene.
The liability risk skyrockets exponentially.
The insurance company would not wait for a criminal conviction.
The sheer presence of verified escrow fraud would compel them to immediately terminate the policy to protect their own corporate exposure. Before I clicked submit, I needed to ensure Carter remained entirely oblivious to the impending cancellation. If he received a notification from the insurer, he might scramble to secure a secondary, high-risk policy from a shady broker. I had to force him to stop checking his vendor portals. I picked up my phone and drafted a text message to Victoria. I forced my thumbs to type the words, burying my pride, to set the ultimate trap. Mom, I am done fighting. The lawyers dropping me was the last straw. I am dropping the civil suit today. I concede. Madeline can have the venue. Please just tell Carter to leave me alone. It was a total, unconditional surrender. Victoria would view it as a triumph of her maternal authority. Carter would see it as a complete capitulation from a broken adversary. They would celebrate their victory, completely dropping their guard. Would you surrender the battle in the courtroom if you knew you had already rigged the battlefield with explosives? Would you bow your head in defeat to ensure your enemy never looks down to see the wire they are about to trip? I sent the text, throwing the phone onto the desk. Then I turned back to the encrypted browser and clicked Submit. The anonymous tip containing the escrow evidence vanished into the digital ether. The relief was instantaneous, but the walls of my condo felt too close, pressing in on the suffocating reality of my isolation. I grabbed my keys, needing to escape the stagnant air of the apartment. I drove my car out of the city, navigating onto the Rickenbacker Causeway. The long bridge stretches out over Biscayne Bay, connecting Miami to the Barrier Islands. I rolled down the windows, the salty ocean breeze whipping through the cabin. The water glittered under the bright morning sun, a vast, beautiful expanse of blue that offered a stark, sharp contrast to the dark, treacherous internal warfare I was currently waging. I had executed a maneuver Carter's lawyers could not fight. I used my literal day job to sever the lifeblood of the stolen wedding, ensuring the cancellation would be absolute, irreversible, and entirely hidden until the last possible second. But the insurance cancellation was only the first phase of the execution. I needed to ensure Carter did not just lose a party, I needed him to lose his freedom. The dual-track revenge required me to escalate the evidence beyond corporate auditors, directly into the hands of federal law enforcement, guaranteeing a coordinated, catastrophic detonation that would trap the parasite exactly when he felt most secure. The salty breeze off the Rickenbacker Causeway cleared the lingering fog of self-pity, clearing the path for cold, calculated execution. The insurance cancellation was a fatal blow to the wedding logistics, but it was a quiet, bureaucratic death. Carter would lose the venue, but he would inevitably spin a lie to protect his ego, blaming a clerical error or an incompetent broker to maintain his facade with Madeline and Victoria. I could not allow him to control the narrative. I needed the destruction of his empire to be public, loud, and legally inescapable. I needed to ensure that when the wedding collapsed, the entire foundation of his fraudulent life collapsed with it. I returned to my condo, the afternoon sun casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floors. I booted up my secure workstation, pulling the files I had extracted from his junior accountant into a new encrypted folder. I added the digital evidence of the forged release of liability, the document he used to secure the corrupt temporary restraining order. I included the pitch decks he circulated to his foreign investors, promising a lavish gala at a historic estate to secure their multi-million-dollar buy-ins. The dossier painted a terrifyingly clear picture of a desperate man running a massive, interconnected Ponzi scheme using a high society wedding as a desperate PR stunt, funded entirely by stolen client escrow money. Miami is a notorious hub for aggressive, high-stakes financial crimes. The federal agencies operating in South Florida are hyper-vigilant, constantly monitoring the volatile real estate market for money laundering and wire fraud. They do not tolerate brokers who treat protected client accounts like personal piggy banks. I navigated to the official whistleblower portal for the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC possesses the unilateral authority to immediately freeze corporate and personal assets pending a federal investigation. They do not require the sluggish timeline of a civil trial. If they verify the evidence of escrow theft, they strike with terrifying speed. I began filling out the intake forms attaching the encrypted files. I structured the report meticulously, highlighting the exact dates and routing numbers of the stolen funds. But the true lethal precision of the strike relied on timing. Carter had booked over $150,000 in lavish upgrades for the wedding. The caviar walls, the custom floral ceilings, the 12-piece band. These elite Miami vendors operate on strict payment schedules. The final, massive balloon payments were scheduled to be drafted from Carter's corporate accounts exactly 48 hours before the wedding day. I timed the submission of the SEC tip to coordinate perfectly with those scheduled drafts. The sudden, simultaneous withdrawal of massive funds, combined with the detailed whistleblower report regarding those specific accounts, would trigger an immediate automated federal banking alert. The SEC algorithms would flag the activity, elevating the investigation to priority status. The asset freeze would not be a slow administrative process. It would hit his accounts violently, ensuring the vendor checks bounced violently on the morning of the wedding. Would you pull the trigger on a federal investigation if you knew the collateral damage would publicly humiliate your family? Would you initiate a sequence of events that guarantees your sister will be left standing at the altar, surrounded by bounced checks and federal agents, just to ensure the parasite is destroyed? I hovered my hand over the mousepad, the cursor resting on the submit button. A sudden, violent tremor seized my fingers. I pulled my hand back, gripping the edge of the desk, my breath hitching in my throat. Sending an anonymous tip to an insurance provider was one thing. Sending a man to federal prison was crossing a Rubicon from which I could never return. If I clicked submit, I was actively detonating a bomb that would shatter my sister's life and permanently destroy the pristine social standing my mother had spent decades cultivating in Coral Gables. I sat in the glow of the monitors for 3 agonizing hours fighting a brutal internal war. I pictured Madeline's face the day she handed me the childhood journal, the raw, vulnerable anxiety hiding behind her influencer facade. I pictured Victoria weeping in my kitchen, begging me to save the fragile child she almost lost. The guilt was heavy, suffocating, pressing down on my chest. I was a risk underwriter, not an executioner. But then I remembered the smirk on Carter's face at the Ventanita when he insulted the only man who had consistently protected me. I remembered the cold, arrogant dismissal in my mother's voice when she told me I did not need a grand venue for my little party. I remembered the absolute terror I felt in the courthouse elevator, trapped by a forged document, realizing they would gladly destroy my legal standing and my sanity just to maintain their illusion of wealth. They did not care about the collateral damage they inflicted on me. Why should I sacrifice my justice to protect the very people who actively engineered my ruin? My hand steadied. The tremors vanished, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I reached for the mouse and clicked submit. The encrypted dossier vanished as my justice to protect the very people who actively engineered my ruin. My hand steadied. The tremors vanished, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I reached for the mouse and clicked submit. The encrypted dossier vanished into the federal servers. The dual-track revenge was officially armed. The insurance cancellation would silently strip the venue of its liability coverage, while the SEC investigation would systematically freeze the stolen capital. The 2 lethal mechanisms were primed to detonate simultaneously, ensuring the stolen wedding would be dismantled piece by piece. I closed my laptop, the quiet hum of the cooling fan the only sound in the dark apartment. The trap was set, but the final agonizing phase required me to walk directly into the center of the illusion and play my part flawlessly. I had to attend the rehearsal dinner. I had to sit across from the man I had just condemned to federal prison and smile, watching him celebrate a victory that was already turning to ash in his mouth. The psychological endurance required for the impending dinner would test the limits of my sanity, pushing me dangerously close to a public breakdown that threatened to unravel the entire timeline before the trap could snap shut. The night before the wedding arrived, draped in the heavy, humid air of South Florida. The rehearsal dinner was not a quiet, intimate gathering of family. It was a sprawling, performative spectacle, hosted on a massive private yacht docked in Biscayne Bay. Carter rented the vessel to impress the foreign investors he had lured to Miami with the promise of the historic estate gala. The entire evening reeked of new money and fragile egos. Waiters carrying trays of expensive champagne and imported caviar navigated the teak decks, while men in linen suits aggressively networked under the guise of celebration. I arrived with Julianne, the temporary restraining order hanging over me like an invisible chain. I was legally required to maintain my distance from the event planning, but my attendance at the rehearsal dinner was a necessary tactical maneuver. I had to project the image of the defeated, obedient sister. I had to let them believe the fake surrender I offered Victoria had permanently broken my spirit. We boarded the yacht, and the gentle rocking of the vessel a stark contrast to the high-wire suspense thrumming through my veins. Victoria greeted us near the gangway, her smile tight and practiced, scanning my simple navy dress for any signs of rebellion. Carter stood near the main bar, holding court with a group of older investors. He looked immaculate, projecting the aura of a man who had successfully conquered his world. I approached him, offering a polite, neutral smile. I held out a gift bag containing a bottle of generic, mass-produced champagne. I bought it at a local grocery store for $15. It was a subtle, deliberate insult, disguised as a gesture of peace, a mocking nod to the cheap, fraudulent foundation of his entire existence. "Congratulations, Carter," I said, handing him the bag. "Julian and I wanted to offer something to celebrate your perfect timing." Carter took the bag, his eyes narrowing slightly as he registered the cheap label peeking out from the tissue paper. He recovered quickly, offering a slick, condescending chuckle. "Thank you, Elena," he drawled, clapping Julianne aggressively on the shoulder. "It is good to see you two accepting the reality of the situation. We appreciate you stepping aside so Madeline could have the venue she deserves. Enjoy the seafood." I nodded mutely, retreating to a small table near the stern of the yacht. The dramatic irony was so thick it was difficult to breathe. He stood there, mocking my generic champagne, completely unaware that the $15 million federal trap I had constructed was currently ticking down its final hours. How do you smile at the man who robbed you when you know his entire world will collapse in less than 12 hours? How do you endure the condescension when you hold the digital trigger to the guillotine, poised directly above his neck? I sat next to Julian, watching the grotesque display of wealth unfold. The anxiety clawed at my stomach, a relentless, gnawing pressure. I needed to ensure the timing of the insurance cancellation aligned perfectly with the municipal regulations. I checked my phone under the table, constantly monitoring the automated confirmation alerts from my secure server. The cancellation of the venue's umbrella liability policy was scheduled to process at exactly 11:59 tonight, effectively stripping the historic estate of its legal right to host commercial vendors the moment the clock struck midnight. The stress of maintaining the facade began to erode my professional restraint. I flagged down a passing waiter taking a glass of crisp white wine. I drank it quickly, the cold liquid doing nothing to numb the sharp edges of my panic. I took a second glass, and then a third. The alcohol fueled the resentment I had carefully bottled up for weeks. Across the deck, Madeline was holding a small group of bridesmaids captivated, describing the lavish custom floral ceilings and the 12-piece band Carter had secured for the reception. One of the bridesmaids, the same blonde woman who had mocked my ceramic bowl at the shower, leaned over and offered a loud, theatrical sigh. "It is just so romantic," she gushed, adjusting her designer clutch. "Carter is a literal prince. I mean, pulling off a booking at that estate at the last minute, he has the best connections in Miami." The sheer density of the delusion snapped my last frayed nerve. I stood up the legs of my chair, scraping loudly against the teak deck. I swayed slightly, the 3 glasses of wine hitting my system with a sudden, dizzying force. I took a step toward the group, the bitter truth burning on my tongue. I wanted to scream that he was not a prince. I wanted to tell the blonde bridesmaid that the lavish upgrades were funded by stolen client escrow money, and that Carter's amazing connections were actually forged legal documents. I opened my mouth, the words forming in my throat. Julian grabbed my wrist, his grip firm and grounding. "Elena," he whispered urgently, his eyes wide with warning. "Do not do it." The sound of his voice pierced the alcoholic haze. The risk underwriter violently wrestled control back from the wounded sister. If I exposed the truth now, I would violate the temporary restraining order, handing Carter the legal justification to have me arrested on the spot. I would ruin the timeline. I would alert him to the trap, giving him 12 hours to scramble and attempt damage control. I clamped my mouth shut, turning on my heel, and physically running across the deck toward the yacht's interior cabins. I locked myself inside a small, lavishly appointed bathroom, leaning over the marble sink, gasping for air. I splashed cold water onto my flushed face, staring at my reflection in the gilded mirror. I had almost detonated the bomb early out of sheer, petty frustration. I was acting like a reckless amateur, endangering the entire operation because I could not stomach the arrogance of a dying man. I stayed in the bathroom for 20 minutes, forcing myself to practice deep, tactical breathing until the urge to scream subsided. When I returned to the deck, the dinner was winding down. The guests were gathering near the bow for a final toast. Carter stood holding a glass of the expensive champagne he had ordered to replace my cheap gift. He raised the glass, the yacht gently rocking beneath his feet. "To my beautiful bride," he announced, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of the bay. "And to the incredible partners standing with us tonight, here is to bulletproof investments and perfect timing." The guests raised their glasses in a chorus of polite applause. Madeline beamed, leaning her head against his shoulder. Victoria wiped a tear from her eye, her socialite illusion fully intact. I stood in the shadows near the stern, my phone hidden in the palm of my hand. I did not raise a glass. I stared at the digital clock on my screen. It read 11:58. Carter took a sip of his champagne, smiling out at the glittering Miami skyline, believing he had successfully manipulated the system, stolen the venue, and secured his fraudulent empire. The numbers on my screen flipped. 11:59. A silent automated confirmation alert flashed across my encrypted portal. The umbrella liability insurance policy covering the historic coastal estate was officially terminated. The legal protection required to host the event evaporated into the humid night air. The venue was now legally barred from opening its doors to commercial vendors. The trap had snapped shut, completely hidden from the people celebrating their stolen victory. The invisible guillotine had dropped, but the blade would not strike until the sun came up. The morning of the wedding was going to dawn with a chaotic, frantic panic as the physical reality of the vendor blackout collided with the horrifying arrival of federal agents, forcing Carter to make a desperate, terrifying decision that would leave my sister completely abandoned. The morning of the wedding broke over Miami with a heavy, stagnant heat. The sky was a pale, hazy blue, promising a sweltering afternoon typical of late spring in South Florida. The city was waking up, the slow, rhythmic pulse of early morning traffic building along the major causeways. But within the sleek, glass-paneled high-rise offices of downtown Miami, a coordinated federal operation was already executing a devastating strike, severing the financial arteries of Carter's fraudulent empire. At precisely 7 o'clock, while Madeline was sitting in a plush hotel suite, surrounded by makeup artists and sipping mimosas, Carter was standing in his Brickell Avenue office. He had arrived early, intending to finalize a few minor administrative details before heading back to his luxury condo to dress for the ceremony. He assumed the day would unfold according to his meticulous PR strategy, ending with a lavish gala that would secure the foreign investment capital he desperately needed. He did not expect the elevators to open, delivering a team of federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, accompanied by armed federal marshals. The raid was not a polite inquiry. It was a rapid, aggressive asset seizure. The agents presented warrants authorizing the immediate confiscation of his corporate servers, hard drives, and physical ledgers. But the most lethal component of the operation was already executing silently through the federal banking networks. The SEC, utilizing the detailed encrypted dossier I had submitted, initiated an emergency freeze on every domestic and offshore account linked to his name and his holding companies. Carter stood in his office watching the agents systematically dismantle the illusion he had spent years constructing. The gravity of the situation crashed down upon him. He knew the escrow theft had been exposed. He knew the paper trail leading to the stolen client funds was undeniable. But the immediate, terrifying reality was not the impending federal indictment. It was the logistics of the wedding he had hijacked. He had issued over $150,000 in post-dated cashier's checks to the premium vendors, the florists, the caterers, the 12-piece band to secure the lavish upgrades. Those checks were scheduled to process this morning upon delivery of the services. With his accounts frozen globally, every single check was going to bounce violently the moment the vendors attempted to deposit them. What is the first thing a parasite does when the host runs out of blood? Do they stay and attempt to save the organism, or do they detach and flee to preserve their own survival? Carter did not call Madeline. He did not attempt to warn Victoria or secure legal representation for his soon-to-be wife. He realized the historic coastal estate was about to become the epicenter of a massive financial scandal, and he had zero intention of standing at the altar when the fallout hit. He grabbed his passport from his office safe, abandoned his leased Maserati in the parking garage to avoid tracking, and hailed a cab heading straight for Miami International Airport. He fled, leaving his bride and the entire logistical nightmare entirely unprotected. I was sitting in my kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee, when the automated alert pinged on my phone. My corporate underwriting software, tied to the monitoring parameters I had established for the SEC tip, confirmed the federal banking freeze had been successfully initiated against his associated LLCs. I stared at the green confirmation text on the screen. The tension that had coiled tight in my chest for months, the suffocating anxiety of the forged temporary restraining order, the humiliation of my mother's betrayal, suddenly snapped. I threw my head back and laughed. It was not a polite, quiet chuckle. It was a loud, harsh, unhinged sound echoing off the white quartz island in my empty apartment. I laughed until my ribs ached, until tears pricked the corners of my eyes. The sheer absurdity of the situation, the image of the arrogant seersucker-wearing broker running terrified from his own wedding, broke through my clinical restraint. For a brief, chaotic moment, I lost my humanity, entirely consumed by the pure, intoxicating adrenaline of absolute vengeance. I had stripped him of his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. But the financial execution was only one half of the dual-track revenge. The secondary trap, the cancellation of the umbrella liability insurance, was about to detonate at the historic venue, exposing the remaining family members to the mechanical, unyielding reality of municipal code enforcement. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the condo. I was legally barred from contacting the venue or the vendors, but the temporary restraining order did not prevent me from utilizing public property. I drove toward the coastal estate, navigating the morning traffic with a calm, surgical focus. I parked my car on a public residential street exactly 1 mile from the massive wrought iron gates of the venue. I rolled down the windows, the humid ocean breeze offering a stark contrast to the sterile air conditioning of my apartment. I pulled a pair of high-powered binoculars from my glove compartment, resting my elbows on the steering wheel, adjusting the focus until the entrance of the estate came into sharp view. It was 8 a.m. The logistical ballet required to execute a massive high-society Miami wedding was scheduled to begin. I watched a fleet of commercial vehicles, a luxury catering truck, 2 large floral delivery vans, and a trailer carrying the audio equipment for the 12-piece band turn onto the private access road approaching the estate gates. They expected the gates to swing open, They expected a frantic wedding planner directing them to the loading docks. They expected to begin assembling the caviar walls and the custom floral ceilings Carter had promised. Instead, they found the heavy wrought iron gates padlocked shut, and standing squarely in front of the entrance, blocking the access road, was a Miami-Dade County Code Enforcement cruiser, its yellow lights flashing lazily in the morning sun. 2 county officers stood on the pavement holding clipboards, refusing entry to every commercial vehicle that approached. The vendor blackout had officially commenced. Without the umbrella liability insurance coverage, the venue managers had legally suspended all operations. The city, notified of the sudden lapse in coverage, dispatched the officers to ensure no commercial activity occurred on the property. The massive, expensive wedding was locked out, entirely dismantled by a missing permit and a canceled policy. I sat in my car watching the caterers argue with the officers, watching the florists frantically dialing their phones, holding wilting bouquets of white hydrangeas in the sweltering heat. The physical trap had snapped shut with flawless mechanical precision. But the satisfaction I felt in my kitchen, the harsh, unhinged laughter, evaporated completely. As I watched the chaos unfold through the lenses of my binoculars, a cold, heavy realization settled over me. The revenge was complete, but the cost was astronomical. The impending arrival of my sister wearing her custom bridal gown to a locked, empty venue would force me to confront the devastating emotional wreckage I had engineered, plunging me into a horrifying realization that would test the very limits of my empathy. The scene playing out through the lenses of my binoculars was a masterclass in bureaucratic execution. Miami event planning operates on a razor-thin margin of error. The logistics required to coordinate luxury caterers, imported floral arrangements, and massive audiovisual installations are incredibly delicate. One missing permit, one lapsed insurance policy, triggers an immediate, merciless shutdown by city officials who possess zero tolerance for municipal liability. I had weaponized that exact vulnerability. I watched the chaos unfold at the gates of the historic coastal estate. The driver of the luxury catering truck stepped out of his cab, waving a thick clipboard at the 2 Miami-Dade Code Enforcement officers blocking the entrance. The officers remained stoic, pointing to the heavy brass padlock securing the wrought iron gates. The caterer pulled out his phone, his face flushed with panicked frustration, likely dialing Carter's disconnected number, demanding an explanation for the lockout. Behind the catering truck, a delivery van belonging to Miami's premier floral design studio idled on the sweltering asphalt. The back doors of the van were open, exposing dozens of towering, elaborate white hydrangea arrangements to the brutal, stagnant Florida morning heat. Without access to the air-conditioned staging areas inside the venue, the delicate flowers would begin wilting within the hour. The $150,000 in lavish upgrades Carter had promised his VIP investors, the caviar walls, the custom floral ceilings, were completely useless, anchored to the sidewalk outside a locked gate. My meticulous underwriting strategy had dismantled the stolen wedding piece by piece, without me ever raising my voice or violating the forged temporary restraining order. I simply let the mechanical, unyielding reality of municipal code enforcement do the heavy lifting. I lowered the binoculars, resting them on the passenger seat. The cold clarity that had guided my actions for months, the clinical precision of the risk underwriter, crystallized in the quiet cabin of my car. I had won. The venue was secured. The parasite was currently fleeing from federal agents. The illusion my mother had sacrificed my happiness to maintain was officially dead. But what does ultimate victory feel like when the cost is detonating your sister's most cherished dream? Do you feel the righteous satisfaction of a victorious general, or do you just feel the heavy, suffocating silence of the fallout? I stared out the windshield, the humid ocean breeze doing nothing to cool the sudden oppressive heat rising in my chest. The image of the wilting flowers, the frantic caterers, the locked gates suddenly stopped feeling like a strategic triumph. It felt like a funeral. The rigid professional armor I had worn since the family dinner, the emotional detachment I used to survive my mother's blackmail, finally cracked. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, the physical pressure the only thing grounding me to reality. A raw, ragged sob tore through my throat, startling me in the quiet car. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the tears spilled over, tracking hot and fast down my cheeks. I cried with a violent, unrestrained grief. I mourned the sister who would arrive in her custom bridal gown, only to find an empty, padlocked building. I mourned the fact that Madeline's crippling anxiety and desperate need for validation had made her the perfect victim for a corporate predator. I mourned the mother who valued a fake socialite facade over the emotional safety of her own daughter. I wept because securing my justice required me to become the architect of my family's total destruction. I sat in my car violently sobbing, the air conditioning blasting against my tear-stained face, unable to reconcile the strategic victory with the monumental personal loss. I had executed the trap flawlessly, but I was entirely alone in the wreckage. My phone vibrated in the cup holder, the sudden mechanical buzz slicing through my breakdown. I picked it up, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. The caller ID displayed Madeline's name. The timeline was accelerating. She was not supposed to arrive at the venue for another 2 hours. The bridal party typically prepared in the hotel suites before transitioning to the estate for photographs. But the chaos at the gates had undoubtedly triggered frantic calls from the vendors. The wedding planner, unable to reach Carter, had likely contacted the bride directly, initiating the panic. I stared at the ringing phone, the clinical underwriter wrestling control back from the grieving sister. I knew what she was going to ask. I knew she was going to beg for a solution, assuming my risk management expertise could somehow bypass the code enforcement officers and unlock the gates. She still believed the illusion could be salvaged. I let the call go to voicemail. I needed to ensure she had the undeniable proof before she spoke to our mother. Victoria would inevitably attempt to spin the narrative, blaming a clerical error or a vendor mistake to protect the socialite image. I had to deliver the fatal blow, ensuring Madeline understood the absolute criminality of the man she intended to marry. I opened the encrypted folder on my phone containing the audited escrow logs. The documents I had submitted to the SEC clearly demonstrated how Carter had siphoned $150,000 from protected client accounts to fund the extravagant vendor deposits. I attached the files to a direct message addressing it to Madeline's personal number. I did not include a comforting note. I did not offer a gentle explanation. I simply typed a single clinical sentence. He did not buy the venue. He stole from his clients to fund the illusion, and the feds froze his accounts this morning. I hit send. The digital payload vanished into the cellular network. I had just handed my sister the forensic proof that her entire identity was built on a calculated financial scam. The transmission of the escrow evidence guaranteed that when she finally stood before the locked gates of the historic estate, the confrontation would not center on a missing permit. It would force a horrifying realization that the man she loved had doomed the wedding from the start, triggering a dramatic emotional collapse that would require me to navigate the most difficult interaction of my life. The text message containing the audited escrow logs marked delivered. I sat in the driver's seat, my breathing slowly returning to a steady rhythm as the air conditioning cooled the sweat on the back of my neck. I waited. The digital transfer of evidence was the primer, but the true detonation required physical proximity. I needed to witness the collapse of the illusion to ensure the break was absolute. I shifted the car into gear, pulling away from my discreet observation point, and drove the remaining mile toward the historic coastal estate. I parked a block away from the main entrance, walking the final distance on foot. The scene at the gates had devolved from bureaucratic confusion into frantic desperation. The humid, stagnant air of the Florida morning pressed down on the chaotic assembly. The sun was climbing higher, baking the asphalt. The massive white hydrangea arrangements abandoned by the frustrated florists on the hot sidewalk were already wilting, the delicate petals turning a sickly, translucent brown. The visual decay of the expensive flowers perfectly mirrored the rotting foundation of the event they were meant to decorate. A sleek black town car pulled up to the curb, abruptly halting behind the idling catering truck. The rear door flew open. Madeline stepped out onto the blistering pavement. She wore her custom bridal gown, an intricate creation of imported silk and layers of delicate tulle, designed to project the flawless image of old money elegance. But the pristine aesthetic was violently juxtaposed against the gritty reality of the locked gate and the sweating code enforcement officers. Her veil dragged across the dirty sidewalk as she rushed toward the entrance, her face pale, her eyes darting frantically from the padlocked iron bars to the confused vendors. Victoria emerged from the other side of the town car wearing a rigid expression of furious denial. She marched directly toward the nearest officer, demanding he remove the chain, citing her influential connections within Coral Gables society. The officer remained stoic, refusing to engage with her elite posturing, simply tapping his clipboard and repeating that the municipal variance and liability insurance were officially revoked. Madeline stood frozen in the center of the chaos, the heavy silk skirt of her gown pooling around her feet. She looked down at her phone, the screen glowing brightly in the harsh morning light. She had opened the encrypted folder. She was reading the escrow logs I sent, tracing the undeniable mathematical proof that her fiancé had siphoned $150,000 from protected client accounts to fund the very vendors currently locked out of her wedding. She looked up, her eyes locking onto me, as I stepped out from the shadow of the banyan tree lining the street. "Elena," she gasped, her voice cracking, a fragile, terrified sound that barely carried over the noise of the idling trucks. She stumbled toward me, the heavy gown hindering her movements. "What is this?" "The text you sent, the bank records. Carter said the bank made a clerical error. He said the permit was a minor zoning issue. Please tell me this is a mistake. You know how to fix this stuff, Elena. Please help me." How do you comfort a sibling when their entire identity was built on a calculated financial scam? Do you offer them a gentle lie to soften the blow, or do you force them to look directly at the monster they chose to marry? I stood firm, crossing my arms over my chest, my posture radiating a cold, clinical detachment. I did not reach out to hold her. I did not offer the sanctuary of an older sister. The resentment, the memory of her handing me that childhood journal while her fiancé mocked my life, burned away any residual empathy. "It is not a mistake, Madeline," I said, my voice flat and merciless, slicing through the humid air. "The permit is gone because I canceled it. And Carter is not answering his phone because the Securities and Exchange Commission froze his accounts and raided his office at 7 o'clock this morning. He is a criminal. He stole from his clients to pay for those flowers wilting on the sidewalk. He doomed this wedding the second he forged my signature to steal the venue." Madeline flinched, physically recoiling as if I had struck her. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a ragged sob. She looked back at the locked gates, the reality of her shattered high society dream crashing down upon her. "You knew," Victoria shrieked, abandoning her argument with the officer and storming toward me, her face flushed a deep mottled red. "You knew he was being investigated, and you let us walk blindly into this humiliation. You did this on purpose." "I did not let you do anything, Victoria," I countered, stepping forward, refusing to back down from the matriarch. "You hijacked my wedding date because you valued his fake wealth over my actual happiness. You blackmailed my lawyers to protect a parasite. I just audited the books. I exposed the rot you were too desperate to ignore." Madeline dropped to her knees, the pristine white silk of her gown soaking up the dirt and grime from the sidewalk. The golden child illusion shattered completely, leaving her a terrified, weeping woman abandoned by a con artist on the morning of her wedding. The public humiliation she had spent her entire life trying to avoid was manifesting in front of the vendors, the police, and the sister she had betrayed. "I told you so," I said, looking down at my sobbing sister, delivering the final, cruel blow. "I tried to warn you at the Ventanita, but you let him mock me. You chose the illusion, Madeline, and this is the price of the ticket." The words were harsh, lacking any basic grace. I was acting like a bully, using my foresight to punish her naivety. I watched her weep, realizing I had allowed the toxicity of my family to poison my own character, turning me into a cold, unforgiving executioner. The victory felt heavy and dark. I turned away from her, ignoring Victoria's furious screams, walking back toward my car. I had forced Madeline to confront the brutal reality of her choices. The physical trap was closed, but the emotional fallout was merely the beginning. The revelation of the escrow theft would trigger a frantic, desperate reaction from Carter, forcing him into a corner where he would attempt one final, devastating maneuver to save himself. He would try to legally implicate Madeline in the federal fraud, shifting the blame to the very woman he abandoned, setting the stage for a brutal legal reckoning that would require my sister to make an agonizing choice between her own survival and the man she almost married. The drive away from the padlocked venue was suffocatingly quiet. I navigated the heavy late-morning Miami traffic, my hands gripping the steering wheel, the air conditioning doing nothing to cool the hot flush of shame burning in my cheeks. I had delivered the killing blow to Carter's fraudulent empire, but the cruel, mercenary way I treated my sister on the sidewalk left a sour, metallic taste in my mouth. I was not the villain, but I was no longer the innocent victim either. The war had changed me. I returned to my condo, seeking the sterile quiet of my home office. I needed to focus on the next phase of the operation. Carter was on the run, his accounts frozen, but the SEC investigation was just beginning. He would need a scapegoat to mitigate his federal exposure. I knew his legal team would advise him to shift the liability of the stolen escrow funds onto Madeline, claiming she had demanded the lavish upgrades and authorized the fraudulent transfers as an acting partner in the wedding planning. I had to secure the physical evidence required to completely insulate my sister from his incoming criminal defense strategy. Before I could draft an email to my corporate attorney, the security buzzer in my foyer chimed. I walked over to the intercom, pressing the connection button. The concierge's voice crackled through the speaker. "Ms. Elena, your mother is downstairs. She is insisting on coming up. She says it is a family emergency." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the release button. Victoria had blackmailed my lawyers. She had explicitly stated that my happiness was collateral damage required to secure Madeline's future. But the situation had fundamentally shifted. The illusion she fought so ruthlessly to protect had just detonated in public. I pressed the button, unlocking the lobby doors. I needed to look her in the eye and establish the final boundary. 5 minutes later, Victoria stood in my entryway. The commanding, polished Coral Gables matriarch who had dictated the terms of my life was gone. She looked old. The sharp, aggressive energy that usually surrounded her had completely evaporated, leaving behind a fragile, trembling shell. She wore the same designer dress from the morning, but it looked rumpled, hanging awkwardly on her slumped shoulders. I did not offer her a seat. I stood in the center of the living room, my posture rigid. She walked toward me, her hands twisting the strap of her handbag, a nervous mirror of Madeline's crippling anxiety. "Elena," she whispered, her voice lacking its usual melodic authority. It sounded raw, scraped hollow by the morning's humiliation. "I just left Madeline at her apartment. She is inconsolable. The vendors are threatening to sue us for breach of contract." The news about the SEC raid is already spreading through the country club. Everyone knows. "I know, Victoria," I replied, my voice dropping to a clinical flat register. "I initiated the raid. I submitted the anonymous tip that froze his accounts." She stopped, her eyes widening in shock. You? You called the federal agents?" He forged my signature on a legal document I stated, stepping forward, pulling a folded piece of paper from my back pocket. He stole client escrow funds to pay for the caviar walls and the 12-piece band. He is a criminal. He was going to drag this entire family down with him. I held out the piece of paper. It was a photocopy of the uncashed $10,000 deposit check Carter had initially given the venue before Victoria transferred the reservation. "Look at the routing numbers," I commanded, shoving the paper into her trembling hands. "It is drawn from the same fraudulent account he used to pay the florists." If the wedding had proceeded, if he had officially married Madeline today, he would have legally tied her to a massive federal wire fraud investigation. She would have been implicated as a co-conspirator, enjoying the fruits of stolen money. I did not just cancel a party. I stopped her from walking blindly into a federal indictment. Victoria stared at the photocopy, the black ink searing the horrifying reality into her mind. The stark, depressing emptiness of the situation finally broke through her denial. She realized that her desperate, frantic favoritism, her insistence on securing a wealthy son-in-law, regardless of the red flags, had nearly destroyed the very child she was trying to protect. She realized that the daughter she treated as an expendable liability, the risk underwriter she dismissed as boring and low maintenance, was the only person who possessed the competence to see the trap and the ruthlessness required to disarm it. The paper fluttered to the floor, slipping from her fingers. Victoria covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, ragged sob that echoed through the quiet condo. "I am so sorry," she wailed, sinking to her knees on the hardwood floor, the designer dress pooling around her. "I am so sorry, Elena. I was just so terrified for her. When she was sick, when she almost died from that fever, I promised myself I would never let her suffer again. I thought Carter was saving her. I thought he was giving her a safe, perfect life. I was so blind. Please forgive me. Please. You saved her. You saved us. If the parent who ignored your pain finally apologizes, is it enough to heal the wound? Can a sincere, tearful admission of guilt wash away decades of calculated cruelty and emotional neglect? Victoria reached out from the floor, attempting to grab my hand, seeking the physical reassurance that her apology was accepted, that the maternal bond was mending. I looked down at the weeping woman on my floor. I saw the trauma. I understood the lingering panic from the childhood fever that had warped her maternal instincts. I felt a profound aching grief for the mother-daughter relationship we never had the chance to build because she was too consumed by fear to love us equally. But understanding her trauma did not erase the abuse. She was not apologizing because she suddenly realized my inherent worth as her daughter. She was apologizing because my forensic logic, my ability to execute a ruthless legal maneuver, proved useful in a crisis. She valued me as a shield, not as a child. I did not take her hand. I physically recoiled, taking a sharp step backward, shoving her outstretched arm away. The movement was harsh, lacking any gentleness or grace. "Do not touch me," I hissed, the residual anger flaring hot in my chest. A sick kid does not give you permission to treat your other daughter like garbage for 20 years. You stole my wedding venue. You blackmailed my lawyers. You told me I was expendable. You do not get to cry on my floor and ask for forgiveness just because the monster you chose turned out to be real. Victoria flinched, pulling her hand back to her chest, looking up at me with eyes full of devastated, absolute rejection. I am going to help Madeline untangle her name from his accounts. I continued, my voice hardening, establishing the ironclad boundary. Because she is my sister, and she needs an underwriter right now. But you and I are done, Victoria. You chose your side at the dinner table. Now you have to live with it. I pointed toward the front door. Get out of my apartment. Victoria did not argue. She slowly pushed herself off the floor, her spirit utterly defeated. She picked up her handbag and walked out of the condo, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. I stood alone in the silent living room, the profound grief settling heavily into my bones. The matriarch's reckoning was complete. Her socialite facade was permanently destroyed. But the emotional battlefield offered no comfort. I had to pivot my focus immediately to Madeline. Carter, backed into a corner by the federal authorities, was preparing to execute a devastating legal maneuver to save his own skin, attempting to implicate my sister in the escrow theft, forcing Madeline to make an agonizing, terrifying choice between her own survival and the man she almost married. The swift, decisive nature of a federal financial investigation in Miami leaves no room for loyalty. The corporate law firms that line Brickell Avenue operate on a simple, brutal ethos. When the Securities and Exchange Commission freezes an account, you either secure an immunity deal or you become a casualty. Carter, having fled the morning of the wedding, realized he could not outrun a federal subpoena. His assets were frozen, his firm had disavowed him, and his reputation was obliterated. He retained a high-priced, aggressive criminal defense attorney who immediately launched a scorched earth strategy designed to mitigate his prison sentence by distributing the guilt. Carter's legal team filed a preliminary defensive brief claiming he was acting under extreme duress. They alleged the escrow theft was not an independent corporate fraud, but a desperate attempt to satisfy the extortionate demands of his demanding, high-maintenance fiancé. The brief argued that Madeline, utilizing her influence as a local lifestyle influencer, had actively directed the unauthorized transfer of client funds to finance her lavish wedding, knowing the money was compromised. He was painting my sister as the mastermind, the greedy socialite who drove him to embezzlement. Madeline was officially in the crosshairs of a federal indictment. I received the frantic call from her the following Tuesday. She was hiding in her rented apartment, the blinds drawn, terrified that federal agents were going to knock down her door. I drove straight to her building, bypassing the security desk and taking the stairs to the 4th floor. I found her sitting on the floor of her living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes of wedding gifts she could not return. She looked exhausted, the crippling anxiety she constantly battled finally consuming her entirely. The polished influencer facade was gone, replaced by a raw, trembling panic. "He is lying, Elena," she sobbed, rocking back and forth, hugging her knees to her chest. "I did not know about the client money. He told me the venue upgrades were a corporate expense, a tax write-off for hosting the investors. He is trying to send me to prison to save himself. I do not have a lawyer. Mom is not returning my calls. What am I going to do?" I stood over her, the clinical risk underwriter, analyzing the shifting battlefield. Carter was launching a desperate offensive, but his strategy relied entirely on circumstantial evidence and character assassination. He needed to prove Madeline had access to his financial operations. We needed to prove he acted alone, with unilateral authority over the escrow accounts. "We need his personal ledger, Madeline," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, projecting a surgical calm to anchor her spiraling panic. Corporate criminals always keep a shadow ledger, an offline record of their illicit transfers, detailing exactly where the money went and who authorized the transaction. He would not leave it on a company server. He would keep a physical copy. Madeline shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "I do not know where it is. I never looked at his files. He kept a locked briefcase in his home office, but he took it with him when he ran. He has everything." I knew she was lying. Not a malicious lie, but a lie born of denial. The psychological conditioning of the golden child, the desperate need to protect the illusion of the perfect, wealthy husband, was still fighting for survival in her brain. She did not want to admit she had seen the monster behind the curtain, because admitting it meant accepting her own profound failure of judgment. I reached into my purse, pulling out the faded leather childhood journal she had given me at the Ventanita in Little Havana. I had kept it, reading through the entries late at night, seeking a connection to the sister I used to know, before Victoria's favoritism poisoned our relationship. I flipped the journal open, turning to a page dated 3 years ago, shortly after she and Carter first started dating. I crouched down, sitting on the floor across from her. I slid the open journal toward her, tapping a specific entry written in her familiar, looping handwriting. "Read it," I commanded. Madeline looked down at the page, her breath hitching. The ink was slightly smeared, holding a confession she had buried deep in her subconscious. "Carter scares me when he yells about money." She read aloud, her voice a fragile whisper. "He locks himself in the study and screams at his partners on the phone. I saw him hide a black notebook inside the lining of his golf bag in the hall closet. He told me if I ever touched it, he would leave me. I do not want him to leave. I will just pretend I did not see it." I pointed at the page. "You knew, Madeline. You knew he was hiding something dangerous, but you chose the illusion. You chose the safety of the country club over the truth. When the golden child finally turns on the parasite, do you trust her, or is it just self-preservation? Do you believe the sudden allegiance is born of genuine remorse, or simply a desperate attempt to avoid a federal prison sentence?" Madeline stared at the journal entry, the undeniable proof of her own willful ignorance breaking the final chains of her denial. The tears stopped, replaced by a hard, cold realization. She was not a victim of a sudden betrayal. She had ignored the warning signs because the truth was too ugly to confront. And now that ugly truth was threatening to lock her in a cage. She did not argue. She did not defend him. She pushed herself off the floor, walking briskly toward the hallway closet. She opened the closet door, pulling out an expensive, heavy leather golf bag. She unzipped a concealed side pocket, her fingers trembling as she reached deep into the lining. She pulled out a small, thick, black notebook secured with a rubber band. She turned around, holding the notebook out to me. Her hands were shaking violently, but her eyes were clear, the crippling anxiety replaced by a fierce, terrifying instinct for survival. "Take it," she said, her voice dropping to a resolute whisper. "Give it to the SEC. Burn him to the ground, Elena." I reached for the notebook, the final piece of evidence required to secure his total annihilation. The adrenaline surged through my veins, a frantic electric current demanding immediate action. I needed to photograph every page and transmit the files to the lead federal investigator before Carter's defense attorneys could file another motion. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opening the camera application. My hands were shaking so badly from the sheer magnitude of the moment, from the realization that my sister had finally chosen reality over the illusion that my grip slipped. The phone tumbled from my hand, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, sickening crack. I gasped, dropping to my knees, snatching the device from the floor. The glass screen was shattered, spiderwebbing from the bottom corner, but the display still functioned. The camera lens was intact. I let out a shaky breath of relief, the frantic rush to seal his fate overriding the minor casualty of the broken phone. I sat on the floor of my sister's apartment, surrounded by unpacked wedding gifts, photographing the shadow ledger, page by page. The handwritten entries detailed every illegal transfer, every forged signature, every stolen dollar, routed from the client escrow accounts to fund the caviar walls and the 12-piece band. The ledger proved Carter acted entirely alone, executing the fraud with unilateral authority. It completely exonerated Madeline. The sisters, fractured by decades of maternal manipulation and toxic competition, were finally aligned against a common enemy. The escrow guillotine was primed. I transmitted the digital files to the federal authorities, securing the final nail in his coffin. The financial war was officially won. But the absolute devastation left in the wake of the battle, the empty aisle, and the shattered socialite facade would force us to confront the bitter, isolating reality of the aftermath, forcing a profound, permanent shift in the dynamic of our family forever. The transmission of the shadow ledger broke the back of Carter's legal defense. The federal prosecutors, operating with brutal efficiency, used his own handwritten notes to secure a grand jury indictment within 72 hours. The charges included multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, embezzlement of protected client funds, and a secondary charge of digital forgery related to the temporary restraining order he had filed against my LLC. The aggressive scorched earth strategy his attorneys attempted, leveraging my sister as a co-conspirator, dissolved instantly. Madeline was fully exonerated, the threat of federal prison lifted from her shoulders. The wedding of the Miami spring season, the lavish event my mother had sacrificed my happiness to secure, was permanently canceled. The cancellation rippled through the elite circles of Coral Gables, not as a quiet postponement, but as a catastrophic public failure. In South Florida high society, a canceled wedding is a permanent social stain, but a wedding canceled due to a federal raid on the morning of the ceremony is a radioactive scandal. The gossip mill was vicious and inescapable. I decided to accelerate the destruction of the illusion. I requested a formal, unredacted copy of the SEC indictment from my attorney. I did not leak it to the local press. I utilized a more surgical, devastating delivery method. I sent the indictment directly to the private email addresses of the women who sat on the charity boards and country club committees with my mother. I ensured the pristine reputation Victoria had spent 3 decades cultivating was annihilated by the undeniable legal reality of the monster she had welcomed into our family. Carter was apprehended a week later. The flashy commercial real estate broker who had driven a leased Maserati and boasted about multi-million-dollar foreign investments was arrested by federal marshals in a dilapidated strip mall in Hialeah, trying to secure a cash loan from a predatory payday lender. The polished facade had completely rotted away, leaving a desperate, broke criminal facing 10 years in federal lockup. Madeline, humiliated but finally free from the toxic anxiety of her fake relationship, moved out of the luxury condo she could no longer afford. She signed a lease on a small, modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. She deactivated her lifestyle influencer social media accounts, retreating from the public eye to begin the arduous process of rebuilding her identity without the crutch of inherited wealth or a wealthy partner. The golden child illusion was dead, replaced by a quiet, guarded reality. Victoria was left completely alone. The socialite friends she had desperately tried to impress abandoned her immediately, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of the federal indictment. Her country club membership was quietly suspended. The massive, opulent house in Coral Gables, once filled with the scent of night jasmine and the loud, performative chatter of elite dinner parties, was now silent and dark. She had sacrificed her relationship with her eldest daughter to protect a high society image that evaporated the moment the money ran out. She had engineered her own isolation. When the people who exiled you finally experience the isolation they engineered, do you feel vindicated, or do you just feel the hollow ache of the void they left behind? I sat in my car idling on the quiet street across from my mother's house. It was a humid Tuesday evening, exactly 1 month after the wedding that never happened. The streetlights cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. The heavy wrought iron gates of the estate were closed. No lights shone through the large front windows. The property looked abandoned, a monument to a ruined legacy. I gripped the leather steering wheel, the engine of my car humming a steady, low rhythm. I could have turned off the ignition. I could have walked up the brick pathway, unlocked the front door, and stepped into the quiet foyer. I could have offered my mother the comfort of a daughter's presence, offering a fragile olive branch in the wake of total destruction. I could have been the bigger person, extending grace to a woman broken by her own hubris. But the memory of her standing in my condo, coldly informing me she had blackmailed my lawyers to drop my case, anchored me to the driver's seat. I remembered the bruising grip of her hands in the hospital hallway when I was 8 years old, demanding I shrink my life to accommodate Madeline's fragility. The resentment burned hot and tight in my chest, overriding my empathy. I was too proud and deeply hurt to offer comfort to the woman who had actively participated in my extortion. I am a risk underwriter. I calculate liability, and the emotional liability of re-engaging with my mother was a risk I was unwilling to assume. I shifted the car into drive, pulling away from the curb, leaving the dark house behind. I drove back to my own condo, the glittering lights of the Miami skyline offering a stark, beautiful contrast to the heavy, isolating silence of my victory. I had won the war. I protected my sister. I neutralized the parasite, and I preserved my professional integrity. The financial execution was flawless, but the emotional cost was monumental. I had detonated my own family's stability. I was safe, but I was entirely unmoored, adrift in the aftermath of the explosion. The toxic family dynamic that had anchored me for 29 years, the constant battle for approval, the quiet resentment, it was all gone. I was standing on a cleared foundation, but I had to figure out how to rebuild my life without the familiar, heavy gravity of their expectations pulling me down. I parked in my garage, riding the elevator up to my floor. I unlocked the door to my apartment, stepping into the quiet sanctuary of my home. Julian was sitting on the sofa reading a book, bathed in the soft, warm light of a reading lamp. He looked up, closing the book, offering a gentle, patient smile. He did not ask where I had been. He did not press for details. He simply stood up, walking over, to wrap his arms around me, pulling me into a grounded, solid embrace. The rigid professional armor I had worn for months finally cracked, releasing a profound, exhausting relief. I buried my face in his shoulder, breathing in the clean scent of ocean salt and laundry detergent, holding on to the only authentic connection that had survived the storm. The war was over, but the final chapter required a conscious, deliberate choice to abandon the performative luxury my family craved and embrace the simple, grounding truth of the life I actually wanted. A choice that would lead us far away from the toxic pretense of Miami high society to a quiet, sun-drenched horizon where the healing could finally begin. The weeks following my decision to leave my mother's house, sitting dark in the rearview mirror, marked a profound shift in the rhythm of my life. The frantic adrenaline, the constant anticipation of the next legal maneuver or emotional ambush, slowly dissipated. The silence that replaced it was heavy at first, an echoing void where the constant noise of my family's demands used to be. I spent my days analyzing corporate risk portfolios, managing my underwriting firm with a renewed clinical focus. I was no longer distracted by the need to secure a municipal variance or intercept federal wire fraud. The battlefield was clear, but the victory left a glaring, unresolved vacancy on my calendar. I still held the non-transferable special event noise and alcohol variance for the historic coastal estate. The venue managers, terrified of the bad publicity generated by Carter's federal raid, had contacted my attorneys, offering a heavily discounted rate to rebook the property for a later date, hoping to salvage the relationship with my LLC. I had the opportunity to reclaim the lavish dream wedding I initially planned. I could have hired the caterers, booked the string quartet, and walked down the grand staircase exactly as I had outlined on the mood boards Madeline had stolen. I looked at the venue contract sitting on my kitchen island. The glossy promotional photos of the estate looked beautiful, but the image felt entirely hollow. The massive historic property no longer represented a celebration of my relationship with Julian. It represented the battlefield where my family had torn each other apart. It was a monument to the toxic performative luxury that had blinded my mother and nearly destroyed my sister. I picked up the contract, tearing the heavy cardstock in half, dropping the pieces into the recycling bin. I did not want a performance. I wanted a marriage. 3 months later, the oppressive humidity of the Miami summer surrendered to the crisp, clear breezes of late autumn. Juliana and I drove south, leaving the glittering, aggressive skyline of Brickell Avenue behind. We crossed the stretch of highway connecting the mainland to the Florida Keys, the water transforming into a brilliant, shallow turquoise, extending endlessly toward the horizon. The Keys operate on a different frequency than Miami. The environment is salty, sun-drenched, and profoundly grounding. The obsession with high society status evaporates the moment you cross the first bridge, replaced by the simple, unpretentious rhythm of the tides. We did not book a venue. We chartered a small, sturdy conservation boat managed by the Marine Biology Institute where Julian worked. Our wedding party consisted of 2 close friends who acted as witnesses and the boat's captain, who was legally ordained to perform the ceremony. Before we left Miami, I made a single, silent concession to the wreckage of my family. I drove to the modest working-class apartment building where Madeline now lived. I did not knock on the door. I did not attempt to force a tearful reconciliation. I simply placed a single, pristine white orchid, the same flower she had intended to use for her massive custom ceilings, on her welcome mat. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the war between us was officially over, even if the relationship remained fundamentally fractured. She was surviving the fallout, and I was moving forward. Can the simple, grounding truth of the ocean wash away the sins of a family obsessed with polished lies? Can the physical removal from a toxic environment truly heal the internal wounds inflicted by the people who raised you? I stood on the deck of the small boat wearing a simple white linen dress, the salty breeze tangling my hair. I wore no shoes, my bare feet gripping the fiberglass deck as the vessel gently rocked against the gentle current. Julian stood across from me, wearing a casual linen shirt, his eyes crinkling at the corners, with a warm, steady smile. There were no caviar walls. There was no 12-piece band. The only soundtrack was the rhythmic slap of the water against the hoe and the distant cry of a seagull. We exchanged our vows under the wide-open Florida sky, the words feeling incredibly heavy and profound, because they were spoken without an audience to perform for. When Julian slipped the simple gold band onto my finger, the metal felt cool and permanent, anchoring me to a reality I had chosen rather than an illusion I was forced to maintain. The captain pronounced us husband and wife. Julian pulled me into a deep, grounding kiss, the applause of our 2 friends carrying over the sound of the ocean. Later that afternoon, we sat on the stern of the boat, watching the sun dip low toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of magenta and burnt orange. I leaned back against Julian's chest, his arms wrapped securely around my waist. The tension that had defined my posture for the last year, the rigid, defensive armor of the corporate risk underwriter, finally dissolved. I felt a cautious, quiet hope blooming in my chest. My phone vibrated in the small, waterproof bag resting near my feet. I leaned forward, pulling the device out to check the screen. The caller ID displayed Victoria's name. It was the 4th time she had called this week. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the incoming call notification pulse. The little girl inside me, the daughter who still craved the approval of the Coral Gables matriarch, felt a familiar tug of guilt. She was my mother, and she was sitting alone in a massive dark house, suffering the isolation she had engineered. I hovered my thumb over the answer button, the internal conflict warring against my logic. But the memory of the courthouse elevator, the terrifying realization that she had blackmailed my lawyers to protect a criminal, surfaced, pulling me back from the edge of capitulation. Forgiving her trauma did not obligate me to absorb her toxicity. I was still deeply flawed, holding on to residual anger, refusing to offer the complete reconciliation she desperately wanted. I swiped the screen, sending the call directly to voicemail. I powered the phone down completely, dropping it back into the waterproof bag. I leaned back against Julian, closing my eyes and listening to the ocean. The victory was messy. I had detonated my family's stability, leaving my sister broke and my mother isolated. I was an imperfect protagonist carrying the scars of a brutal financial execution. But as the boat drifted slowly through the calm, clear waters of the Keys, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. I had stripped away the polished lies and the toxic pretense, refusing to underwrite the rot of my family's foundation. The historic estate in Coral Gables remained an empty shell, a monument to a stolen dream that never materialized. But the foundation I was building now, anchored by the quiet, steady man holding me and the authentic, unpretentious reality of the ocean, was finally built on solid ground, a truth that no amount of forged documents or maternal blackmail could ever tear apart. Looking back at the day I stood in that Coral Gables dining room, bleeding onto my mother's imported table runner, I realized the pain was a necessary catalyst. I spent my 20s assessing commercial risk, calculating disaster for external clients, while willfully ignoring the liabilities living inside my own family. When Carter hijacked my venue and Victoria orchestrated my legal isolation, they assumed I would simply absorb the loss. They expected me to fold. They failed to calculate the cost of pushing a risk underwriter past the point of return. I did not just cancel a party. I dismantled a fraudulent empire, piece by piece. Navigating the wreckage of my family taught me 5 uncompromising truths about survival and self-worth. First, I learned that familial loyalty is not a blank check. You are not obligated to underwrite the toxic behavior of the people who share your blood. When a family member proves they are a daily liability to your peace of mind, you have the inherent right to cancel the policy and walk away without a shred of guilt. Second, an illusion requires relentless, exhausting funding. But the truth stands on its own. Carter and Madeline built an entire identity on leased luxury and stolen client funds. They needed a historic estate to feel important. True security does not require a 12-piece band or public validation. It is built quietly on solid, honest ground. Third, empathy does not require martyrdom. I finally understood that my mother's cruel favoritism stemmed from the trauma of nearly losing a sick child. I can pity the terrified woman she was without allowing her to manipulate the woman I am today. You can acknowledge the origin of a psychological wound while firmly refusing to let the person holding the knife near you ever again. Fourth, the most lethal weapons are often the quietest. I did not win the financial war by throwing coffee or screaming in a crowded courthouse. I won by reading the fine print. Municipal permits, insurance liability clauses, and federal whistleblower portals are far more effective than public tantrums. Real power does not need to raise its voice. It just files the correct paperwork. Finally, I learned that survival is rarely a clean cinematic triumph. You can outsmart a predator, protect your sibling, and secure your own future while still mourning the family you lost along the way. Healing is a messy, imperfect, daily process. I still ignore my mother's phone calls. I still feel the lingering sting of her betrayal. You do not have to be perfectly healed to be free. The sun is setting over the Florida Keys, painting the horizon in shades of indigo and gold. The air smells of salt and impending rain. I am no longer the obedient daughter shrinking myself to fit into a shallow, high society photograph. I am the architect of my own quiet life, anchored by a man who loves me and a truth I fought hard to protect. If you are listening to this right now and you feel trapped by a family that treats your boundaries as mere suggestions, remember that you hold the pen. You have the authority to revoke their access to your energy. Thank you for joining me here on Sofia Told Stories. If my journey resonated with your own struggles,